A single mother with no options, she agrees to pretend to be the wife of a billionaire tycoon to ensure her son has food. The marriage was supposed to be just a contract, but it soon turns into a dangerous game of betrayals and secrets. But when the tycoon discovers the truth about the child, he realizes he may have made the biggest mistake of his life. Sofia Martinez stared at her reflection in the grimy window of the bus, watching as the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan grew closer. Her son Miguel slept peacefully beside her, his small head resting against her arm. At just 6 years old, he was too young to understand why they had left their comfortable life in Madrid, too innocent to comprehend the desperate circumstances that had brought them to New York City. The letter in her purse felt heavy, like a stone weighing down her every movement. It contained an offer that seemed too good to be true, and probably was. But what choice did she have? The custody hearing was in 3 weeks, and without a stable job or permanent residence, she knew the odds were stacked against her. Miguel's paternal grandparents, wealthy and influential, were determined to take him away from her. The bus lurched to a stop in front of Grand Central Station, and Sofia gently shook Miguel awake. "Cariño, we're here," she whispered, smoothing his dark curls away from his face. He blinked sleepily, clutching his worn, stuffed elephant closer. "If this story caught your interest, watch until the end and subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories." Continuing. They made their way through the bustling terminal, Sofia's heart pounding with each step. The address on the letter led them to a gleaming office building that seemed to touch the clouds. The security guard eyed her suspiciously as she approached the desk, taking in her worn clothes and tired appearance. "I have an appointment with Mr. Alexander Sterling," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The guard's eyebrows shot up, but he checked his computer and surprisingly nodded. The elevator ride to the 87th floor felt eternal. Sofia used the time to straighten her hair and clothes as best she could, while Miguel pressed his face against the glass wall, watching the city shrink beneath them. Alexander Sterling's office was exactly what Sofia had expected, all chrome, glass and power. The man himself, however, was not. She had imagined someone older, perhaps portly and balding. Instead, she found herself face to face with a man who couldn't be more than 40, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than she had made in a year as a teacher in Madrid. His steel-gray eyes assessed her coldly, moving from her scuffed boots to her second-hand coat before settling on Miguel. Something flickered in his expression, surprise perhaps, or recognition, but it was gone so quickly Sofia thought she might have imagined it. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice clipped and businesslike. "Please, sit." Sofia guided Miguel to one of the leather chairs facing Sterling's desk, pulling out her tablet and some coloring books to keep him occupied. She could feel Sterling watching this small domestic scene with an unreadable expression. "I received your letter," she began, but Sterling held up a hand to stop her. "Before we discuss anything, I need to be clear about something," he said, leaning forward slightly. "What I'm proposing is purely a business arrangement, a marriage of convenience, nothing more. You need financial security and legal status to keep custody of your son. I need a wife to fulfill certain requirements of my family's trust fund. This would be a contract, Miss Martinez, not a fairy tale." Sofia lifted her chin, meeting his gaze steadily. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Sterling. I'm not looking for a fairy tale. I'm looking for a way to keep my son." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response. "The terms would be simple. We marry, you and your son move into my home, and we maintain the appearance of a normal marriage for a minimum of 1 year. In return, you receive financial security, citizenship through marriage, and my support in your custody battle. After the year is up, we can quietly divorce and you'll receive a generous settlement." Sofia glanced at Miguel, who was completely absorbed in his coloring. "And what would your requirements be? What would you expect from me?" "Discretion, primarily. The ability to play the role of a devoted wife in public, attendance at certain social functions, and—" He paused, his eyes moving to Miguel again. "I would expect you both to live in my home. Separate rooms, of course, but we need to maintain appearances." The proposal was straightforward, almost clinical in its simplicity. Yet Sophia could sense undercurrents of something deeper, something Sterling wasn't saying. Why would a man like him need to resort to such an arrangement? What was he not telling her? "I'll need time to think about it," she said finally. Sterling's mouth curved into a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You have until tomorrow morning. My driver will pick you up at your hotel at 9 a.m. if you decide to accept. If not," he shrugged elegantly. "I wish you the best of luck with your custody battle." As Sophia stood to leave, gathering Miguel's things, Sterling spoke again. "Miss Martinez, one more thing. If you accept, you need to understand that there's no going back. Once we start this, we play it through to the end. No matter what happens." There was something in his tone that made Sophia shiver, despite the warmth of the office. She nodded once, then took Miguel's hand and led him toward the door. As they waited for the elevator, she could feel Sterling's eyes on them through the glass walls of his office. The ride down was silent, except for Miguel's quiet humming. Sophia's mind raced with possibilities and fears. Was she really considering this? Marrying a stranger to keep her son? But as she looked down at Miguel's innocent face, she knew she would do anything to keep him safe and with her. That night in their small hotel room, Sophia watched Miguel sleep while she turned the decision over and over in her mind. The custody hearing loomed like a shadow over their future. Without this marriage, without Sterling's influence and resources, she knew she would lose Miguel. His grandparents would take him back to Spain, and she might never see him again. As dawn broke over the city, Sophia made her decision. She would marry Alexander Sterling. She would enter his world of wealth and power, play by his rules, and do whatever it took to keep her son. She just prayed she wasn't making a deal with the devil himself. The Sterling mansion loomed before them like a fortress, its limestone facade gleaming in the morning sun. Sophia clutched her small suitcase tighter as the iron gates swung open. Admitting the sleek black car that had collected them from the hotel, Miguel pressed his face against the window, his eyes wide with wonder at the manicured gardens and fountain-adorned. "Circular driveway, Mama, it's like a castle," he whispered excitedly in Spanish. Sophia managed a small smile, though her stomach was tied in knots. The wedding ceremony at City Hall had been brief and businesslike, with Sterling's lawyer serving as their only witness. Now, barely 2 hours. Later, they were arriving at what would be their new home. As they stepped out of the car, the massive front door opened to reveal a striking woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored black dress. Her silver-streaked dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression was carefully neutral as she descended the steps to meet them. "Welcome to Sterling Manor," she said, her voice carrying a hint of a British accent. "I'm Mrs. Clark, the head of household. Mr. Sterling has asked me to show you to your rooms and acquaint you with the house rules." Sophia noticed how Mrs. Clark avoided addressing her as Mrs. Sterling, but she bit back any comment. This wasn't the time to assert herself. She needed to understand the dynamics of this household first. "Thank you," Sophia replied politely, guiding Miguel forward. "This is my son, Miguel." Mrs. Clark's gaze swept over the boy, and something flickered in her eyes, the same odd recognition Sophia had noticed in Sterling's expression yesterday. Before she could dwell on it, Mrs. Clark turned sharply and led them into the house. The interior was a study in understated luxury, cream-colored walls, gleaming hardwood floors, and artwork that Sophia suspected cost more than she'd earned in her entire teaching career. As they followed Mrs. Clark up the grand staircase, Sophia noticed a young woman watching them from a doorway, her pretty face twisted with barely concealed hostility. "That's Victoria," Mrs. Clark said, following Sophia's gaze. "She's been Mr. Sterling's personal assistant for the past 5 years." The emphasis she placed on personal made Sophia's skin prickle with unease. Their rooms were on the 3rd floor, in what Mrs. Clark referred to as the family wing. Miguel's room took his breath away. It had been fully furnished with everything a 6-year-old boy could dream of, from a miniature race car bed to shelves filled with books and toys. "Mr. Sterling had it prepared specially," Mrs. Clark said. and there was something in her tone that Sophia couldn't quite decipher. "Your suite is next door, Mrs. Sterling." This time she used the title, but it sounded more like an accusation than a courtesy. Sophia's rooms were equally luxurious, a sitting room, bedroom, and enormous bathroom, all decorated in soft blues and creams. Her few belongings looked painfully out of place among the expensive furnishings. "Dinner is served promptly at 7, Mrs. Clark informed her. "Mr. Sterling expects the family to dine together when he's home. The chef will need to know about any dietary restrictions." She paused, then added with careful precision, "Victoria usually dines with Mr. Sterling when you weren't here." The implication was clear. Sophia was an intruder in a well-established household. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Sterling. "Emergency board meeting. Won't be home for dinner. Make yourself comfortable." Mrs. Clark seemed to sense her disappointment. "Mr. Sterling works late most nights," she said, with just a hint of satisfaction. "Victoria often stays at the office with him. They're very dedicated to the company." After Mrs. Clark left, Sophia sat on the edge of her new bed, feeling overwhelmed. Through the wall she could hear Miguel playing with his new toys, his excitement evident in his stream of happy chatter. At least he was adapting quickly. A soft knock at her door made her jump. A young maid stood in the doorway, her expression friendly, the first genuine smile Sophia had seen since arriving. "I'm Lucy," she said, entering with an armful of fresh towels. "Don't let them get to you. Mrs. Clark and Victoria, they're just territorial. They've run this house for years and you're changing their perfect little system." Sophia smiled gratefully. "Is it that obvious how uncomfortable I am?" Lucy laughed, softly. "Let's just say I recognize that deer-in-headlights look. Listen, there's something you should know. Victoria, she's been trying to catch Mr. Sterling's attention for years. Everyone knows she thought she'd eventually become Mrs. Sterling herself. And now I'm here instead," Sophia sighed. "No wonder she looks at me like she wants me to disappear." "Just watch your back," Lucy advised. "Victoria has a lot of influence here, and she's not above playing dirty to get what she wants." Later that evening, as Sophia helped Miguel get ready for bed in his new room, she noticed a photograph she hadn't seen before. It sat on his dresser, a picture of Sterling as a young boy, posed formally in what looked like this very house. Something about the boy's features, his coloring, struck her as familiar, but before she could examine it closer, the frame was suddenly snatched away. "That doesn't belong here," Victoria said sharply from the doorway. "Mrs. Clark must have forgotten to remove it when the room was being prepared." She clutched the photo to her chest, glaring at Sophia as if she'd been caught snooping through private papers. "Mr. Sterling is very particular about family photographs. They're not to be disturbed." After Victoria left, Sophia tucked Miguel into his race car bed, her mind turning over this strange incident. There was something about that photograph, something important she was missing. But as Miguel's eyes began to droop, she pushed the thought aside. She had enough to worry about without trying to unravel the mysteries of Alexander Sterling's childhood. Still, as she lay in her own bed later that night, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into something far more complex than a simple marriage of convenience. In this house of secrets and unspoken tensions, she would need to watch every step carefully. One wrong move could bring everything crashing down, and Miguel was the one who would pay the price. The first week at Sterling Manor passed in a blur of awkward dinners and tense encounters. Sophia quickly learned to navigate the complex hierarchy of the household, to recognize which servants were aligned with Victoria and which, like Lucy, might become allies. But it was during an ordinary Sunday afternoon that everything began to shift. Sophia was in the Manor's vast library, searching for books Miguel might enjoy when she heard something unexpected, laughter. Not just any laughter, but Miguel's distinct giggle, followed by a deeper chuckle she had never heard before. Following the sound, she found herself at the entrance to Sterling's private study. The door was ajar, and through the gap, she saw something remarkable. Alexander Sterling, the man who barely acknowledged their existence during formal dinners, was sitting cross-legged on the floor with Miguel. Between them was an elaborate setup of toy cars and what appeared to be a hand-drawn racetrack on expensive-looking paper. "No, no," Sterling was saying, his usual corporate demeanor completely absent. "If you bank the turn too sharply, the car will flip. Here, let me show you." He demonstrated with one of the toys, making appropriate racing sounds that sent Miguel into another fit of giggles. Sophia stood frozen, not daring to move. In that moment, Sterling looked younger, softer somehow. The harsh lines around his mouth had disappeared, and his eyes held a warmth she'd never seen before. "Mrs. Sterling," Mrs. Clark's sharp voice behind her made Sophia jump. "I wasn't aware you had permission to be in this wing of the house." Before Sophia could respond, the study door opened fully. Sterling stood there, his walls back up, though a faint flush colored his cheeks. "It's fine, Mrs. Clark." Miguel was just helping me test some prototype toys for our new children's division. But Sophia had seen enough to know that wasn't true. The moment had been genuine, unplanned, and that seemed to unsettle Sterling more than any business crisis could. "Miguel," Sophia called softly, "time for your piano lesson." "Ah, Mama," Miguel protested, but began gathering the toys. Sterling watched him with an odd expression, then suddenly spoke. "He could skip the lesson today. We're not quite finished here." Mrs. Clark's sharp intake of breath matched Sophia's own surprise. Sterling had never shown any interest in their daily routines before. "Please, Mama," Miguel pleaded. "Mr. Sterling is teaching me about racing dynamics." The word struck Sophia like lightning. Dynamics. She glanced at the racing track, at Sterling's careful demonstrations of turns and angles. He wasn't just playing. He was teaching physics to a 6-year-old in a way that made it feel like a game. "Very well," she found herself saying, "but just for today." As she turned to leave, she caught sight of Victoria standing in the hallway, her face dark with barely suppressed rage. The woman turned sharply and disappeared around the corner, her heels clicking against the marble floors, like angry punctuation marks. Later that evening, Sophia overheard a heated conversation between Victoria and Mrs. Clark in the kitchen. "It's happening exactly as we feared," Victoria was saying. "That boy is worming his way into Alexander's heart. If this continues—" "Patience," Mrs. Clark's voice was low and stern. "Remember what Mr. Harrison said. We must wait for the right moment." The mention of Harrison sent a chill down Sophia's spine. She had heard that name before. Charles Harrison, Sterling's cousin and the board member, who had voted against every one of Sterling's proposals in the last meeting. Lucy had mentioned him, describing him as a man who had always lived in Sterling's shadow, burning with resentment. That night, unable to sleep, Sophia found herself drawn to Miguel's room. He was sleeping peacefully, clutching his old stuffed elephant along with a new toy car. A gift from Sterling, she realized. On his dresser, she noticed something odd. The photograph that Victoria had so hastily removed had been replaced with a different one, a recent picture of Sterling in his office. But it was the frame that caught her attention. It was identical to the one that had held Sterling's childhood photo, but this one was new. Sophia picked it up carefully, and as she did, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It was a newspaper clipping, dated 20 years ago. Most of it had been torn away, but the remaining fragment made her blood run cold. Tragic accident claims lives of prominent family, leaving sole heir Alexander Sterling. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Sophia quickly replace the frame. She slipped out of Miguel's room just as Mrs. Clark rounded the corner, carrying what looked like a stack of old documents. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Sterling?" Mrs. Clark's tone was polite, but her eyes were sharp. "Yes, just checking on Miguel," Sophia replied, noticing how Mrs. Clark shifted the documents away from view. "Mr. Sterling asked me to remind you about tomorrow's charity gala," Mrs. Clark said. "It will be your first public appearance as his wife. Victoria has arranged for a stylist to help you prepare. We wouldn't want you to feel overwhelmed." The word carried weight, and Sophia understood the implied threat. Tomorrow she would be presented to New York's elite, and one wrong move could destroy everything. But as she lay in bed that night, her mind kept returning to the scene in Sterling's study. For a moment she had glimpsed something real beneath his carefully constructed facade, something that seemed to center around Miguel. What was it about her son that had caused such a crack in Sterling's armor? And why did that simple moment of connection seem to terrify Victoria and Mrs. Clark so much? As Sophia drifted off to sleep, the torn newspaper clipping haunted her dreams, hinting at secrets that could either save them all or tear everything apart. The stylist Victoria had arranged arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, bringing with her an army of assistants and a dress that Sophia suspected cost more than her entire former wardrobe. The gown was a deep midnight blue, elegant in its simplicity, yet Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that Victoria had chosen it to emphasize her outsider status among New York's old money elite. "Mr. Sterling insisted on Valentino," Victoria said, watching Sophia's reflection in the mirror as the stylist worked. "Though I suggested something more conventional." Her smile was sharp as cut glass. "The gala is quite traditional. Old families, old money. I'm sure you'll find it all very educational." Sophia met Victoria's gaze in the mirror, refusing to be intimidated. How fortunate that I was a teacher then. As the stylist applied the finishing touches to her makeup, Sophia's thoughts drifted to Miguel. He would be staying home with Lucy, who had promised a night of pizza and movies. Sterling had been surprisingly insistent about the arrangement, overruling Mrs. Clark's suggestion of a more suitable caregiver. The transformation complete, Sophia barely recognized herself. The woman in the mirror looked like she belonged in Sterling's world, though her eyes still held a wariness that no amount of expensive makeup could hide. "Well," Victoria said, her tone carefully neutral, "I suppose it will have to do. Remember, Mrs. Sterling, tonight isn't just about appearances. The Franklin Adams Foundation Gala is where the real business of New York happens. Try not to say anything that might embarrass Alexander." When Sterling came to escort her downstairs, Sophia saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. For a moment he simply stared, and Sophia felt her cheeks warm under his scrutiny. "You look—" he started, then seemed to catch himself. "Appropriate. You'll do fine tonight. Just stay close to me and follow my lead." The gala was being held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and as their limousine pulled up to the entrance, Sophia's nervousness returned full force. Cameras flashed as Sterling helped her from the car, his hand warm and steady at the small of her back. "Smile," he murmured, guiding her up the steps. "Charles Harrison is watching." Sophia looked where Sterling had indicated and saw a distinguished-looking man in his 40s observing them with calculated interest. Charles Harrison, Sterling's cousin and rival, was handsome in a polished way, but something about his smile made Sophia's skin crawl. "Alexander," Harrison called, moving toward them with practiced ease. "And this must be the mysterious bride we've all been dying to meet." His eyes raked over Sophia with uncomfortable intensity. "I must say, cousin, you've surprised us all. A schoolteacher from Madrid? How unconventional." Sterling's hand tightened slightly at Sophia's waist. "Sophia, Charles sits on the board of Sterling Enterprises. He's very interested in our new children's education division, aren't you, Charles?" "Among other things," Harrison replied smoothly. "In fact, I was just discussing it with some of our shareholders. They're quite concerned about the company's new direction." Before Sterling could respond, Victoria appeared at Harrison's elbow, stunning in a red gown that Sophia realized was meant to draw every eye. "Mr. Harrison, the Ashworths were hoping to discuss the proposal we talked about." Sophia noticed how naturally Victoria fit into this world, how the other guests smiled and nodded at her with easy familiarity. This was the life Victoria had wanted for herself, the life she believed Sophia had stolen. As the evening progressed, Sophia found herself navigating a minefield of subtle insults and probing questions. Each conversation felt like a test, with the other guests watching for any sign of weakness or impropriety. During dinner, she was seated beside an elderly woman who introduced herself as Margaret Ashworth. "Such a lovely surprise to meet you, my dear," the woman said, her voice kind but her eyes sharp. "You know, I knew Alexander's mother quite well. Poor Claire, she had such hopes for her son's future." Sophia's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Did you know her well?" "Oh yes, we served on several boards together. She was particularly passionate about children's education. In fact, Margaret's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. She established quite an extensive trust fund for her future grandchildren. Very specific requirements, though. The child had to be of sterling blood, you see. Claire was quite traditional about such things. Sophia's mind raced, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving starting to fall into place. The odd reactions to Miguel, Sterling's sudden interest in him, Victoria's barely concealed panic. A commotion at the other end of the table interrupted her thoughts. Charles Harrison had stood up, tapping his glass for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I might have a moment. As many of you know, Sterling Enterprises has been like a second family to me. And family, as my dear cousin Alexander knows, is everything to us." Sterling had gone very still beside Sophia, his knuckles white around his water glass. "Which is why," Harrison continued, his smile not quite reaching his eyes, "I feel it's my duty to announce some changes to our company's structure. The board has been conducting a thorough review of our leadership, and we've come to some interesting conclusions." "Charles," Sterling's voice carried a warning, but Harrison pressed on. "It seems there are some irregularities in recent company decisions. Questions about judgment, about priorities, about family loyalty." His eyes fixed on Sophia. "The board will be meeting next week to discuss these findings in detail. I'm sure it will be most illuminating." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of whispers and sidelong glances. On the ride home, Sterling was silent, his face illuminated by the passing streetlights as he stared out the window. It wasn't until they were pulling through the manor's gates that he finally spoke. "Harrison's making his move," he said quietly. "He's been waiting years for this opportunity, and now he thinks he's found my weakness." He turned to look at Sophia, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk about Miguel." But before he could continue, Sophia's phone buzzed with a text from Lucy. "Come quickly, something's wrong. Miguel's asking for you." The look that passed between them spoke volumes. Whatever revelations Sterling had been about to share would have to wait. Their carefully constructed world of appearances and half-truths was about to crack, and Sophia had a feeling that when it did, nothing would ever be the same. Sophia barely waited for the car to stop before rushing into the manor, her expensive gown rustling as she ran up the stairs. Sterling followed close behind, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of genuine concern. They found Lucy pacing outside Miguel's room, wringing her hands. "He has a fever," Lucy explained quickly. "But it's not just that. He was having nightmares calling out for his father. And then," she glanced nervously at Sterling, "he started talking about a memory, about a park in Madrid, and a man who used to take him to feed the ducks." Sophia felt the blood drain from her face. Miguel had never mentioned these memories before. She hadn't even been sure he had them. He'd been so young when Thomas had left them. Inside the room, Miguel was tossing restlessly in his race car bed, his dark curls plastered to his forehead with sweat. When he opened his eyes, they were glassy with fever. "Mama," he whispered, "I saw Papa in my dream. He was at the park, like before, but his face kept changing." Sterling stepped forward, and something in his movement caught Miguel's attention. The boy's eyes widened, and he said something that made everyone in the room freeze. "You look like him, like the picture in the park." Before anyone could respond, Mrs. Clark appeared in the doorway. "I've called Dr. Bennett. He'll be here shortly." Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. Sophia still in her gala gown, Sterling standing unusually close to Miguel's bed, and Lucy hovering uncertainly by the door. "Mrs. Sterling, perhaps. You should change while we wait for the doctor. I'm sure Mr. Sterling and I can handle things here." But Sterling's voice cut through the tension. "No, Sophia stays." There was something different in his tone, an emotion Sophia couldn't quite identify. "Mrs. Clark, please wait for the doctor downstairs. Lucy, you may go." Once they were alone, Sterling sank into the chair beside Miguel's bed. He reached out hesitantly, then placed his hand on Miguel's forehead with surprising gentleness. "Tell me about the park in Madrid," he said softly. Miguel's fever-bright eyes focused on Sterling's face. "There were ducks," he said sleepily. Papa would let me throw bread to them, but Mama said we couldn't go anymore after he went away. Sterling's hand trembled slightly. When was this, Miguel? Do you remember what time of year? Spring, Sophia answered for him, her voice barely a whisper. The spring of 2019. Thomas, Miguel's father, he was only in Madrid for a few months. He never told me why he was there. Only that he was handling some business. When he left, she swallowed hard. He just disappeared, no explanation, no goodbye, just a note saying he couldn't stay. Sterling's face had gone pale. Spring of 2019, he repeated. I was in Madrid then too. Family business. His eyes met Sophia's, and she saw something like recognition dawning in them. Sophia, what was Thomas's last name? Before she could answer, Dr. Bennett arrived, breaking the moment. The next hour was a blur of examinations and medications. The doctor diagnosed a severe flu, but assured them Miguel would be fine with rest and proper care. As the doctor was leaving, Sophia overheard him speaking quietly to Sterling in the hallway. It's remarkable, you know. He has the same genetic marker for drug reactions that your family does. I'll make sure to note it in his chart. Sophia's mind was spinning. The timing of Thomas's presence in Madrid, Sterling's business there, the genetic marker, and now Miguel's fever-induced memories of a man whose face seemed to blur with Sterling's in his dreams. Later that night, after Miguel had finally fallen into a peaceful sleep, Sophia found Sterling in his study. He was standing by the window, holding what looked like an old photograph. I need to show you something, he said without turning around. But once I do, everything changes. There's no going back. Sophia stepped closer, her heart pounding. I think I already know. Sterling turned then, and she saw that the photograph in his hands was the one Victoria had taken from Miguel's room, the one of Sterling as a boy. But now she could see it clearly, and her breath caught in her throat. The resemblance was undeniable. Thomas Sterling, he said quietly. My younger brother, the one everyone thought was lost in the accident with our parents. He survived, but he was different after that. Troubled. He disappeared years ago, and I never stopped looking for him. Sophia sank into a chair, her legs no longer able to support her. That's why you agreed to this marriage. You knew, didn't you? From the moment you saw Miguel. I suspected, Sterling admitted, but I couldn't be sure. Thomas changed his name so many times over the years. When your letter arrived with Miguel's photo, I had to know. A soft knock interrupted them. It was Lucy, looking worried. I'm sorry, but you need to see this. Victoria's just left the house with a file of documents. She was heading toward Mr. Harrison's car. Sterling's expression hardened. So it begins. Harrison must have figured it out too. If Miguel is Thomas's son, then he's not just my nephew. He's a legitimate heir to the Sterling fortune. And that changes everything. Sophia felt cold fear grip her heart. What do you mean? The trust fund my mother set up, it can only be accessed by a Sterling heir. Harrison's been trying to gain control of it for years, but as long as there was no heir, it remained under my control. If he can prove Miguel's claim, Sterling's voice trailed off. He could take everything, Sophia finished, not just the company, but Miguel too. Sterling moved to his desk and pressed a button. Hidden panels in the walls slid open, revealing screens filled with data and documents. We don't have much time. Harrison and Victoria will move quickly now. We need to protect Miguel. And to do that, we need to uncover the truth about what really happened to Thomas. As Sophia watched Sterling begin to work, she realized that their carefully constructed facade of a marriage had just become something else entirely. They were now partners in a race against time, trying to protect not just their arrangement but their family, however unexpected that family might be. Through the open door, she could see Miguel sleeping peacefully, unaware that his fever-induced memories had just set in motion events that would change all their lives forever. Whatever came next, Sophia knew one thing for certain. She would do anything to protect her son, even if it meant trusting Alexander Sterling with the truth about their past. Dawn was breaking over Manhattan when Sophia finally looked up from the stack of documents spread across Sterling's study. Her eyes were burning from hours of reading through old reports, newspaper clippings, and personal letters. Sterling sat at his desk, his tie loosened and sleeves rolled up, looking equally exhausted. As he scrolled through decades-old financial records, "Here's something," Sophia said, holding up a yellowed envelope. "A letter from Thomas to your mother, dated just a month before the accident. He mentions feeling watched, that someone was following him around campus." Sterling's head snapped up. "What date exactly?" "March 15th, 2004. "Why?" He swiveled his computer screen toward her. "Because on March 16th, someone withdrew a significant amount from one of our family's secondary accounts. I always assumed it was Thomas, but the signature—" He enlarged the image. "That's Harrison's handwriting." A knock at the door made them both jump. Lucy entered carrying a tray of coffee and looking concerned. "Mrs. Clark is asking questions. It's about why you've been in here all night, and Victoria just arrived. She's on the phone with someone, speaking in whispers." "Thank you, Lucy," Sterling said, taking the coffee. "Keep an eye on them, but be careful. They can't know what we're doing." After Lucy left, Sophia voiced the question that had been nagging at her. "Why did you hire Victoria in the first place? You must have known she couldn't be trusted." Sterling's expression darkened. "Keep your friends close, and your enemies closer. Victoria was Harrison's plant from the beginning. I needed to know what he was planning." He paused, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "What I didn't expect was for her to become so personally invested." Sophia thought about Victoria's barely concealed rage whenever Sterling showed any attention to her or Miguel. She really believed she could become Mrs. Sterling, didn't she? Harrison encouraged that belief. He probably promised her a share of the company once he took control. Sterling's laugh was bitter. "The irony is, if Thomas hadn't disappeared, none of this would have happened. He was always meant to run the company, not me." This revelation startled Sophia. "What do you mean?" "I was the scholarly one, more interested in physics and engineering than business. Thomas had the natural charm, the instinct for deals. But after the accident—" Sterling's voice trailed off as he stared at an old family photo on his desk. "He changed, became paranoid, started talking about conspiracies. When he disappeared, I had to step up. The company would have gone to Harrison otherwise." A small sound from the doorway made them both turn. Miguel stood there in his pajamas, his fever broken but his face serious. "Mama, Mr. Sterling, why are you looking at Papa's pictures?" The adults exchanged glances. Miguel had called the man in the photographs Papa. He recognized Thomas, even from these old images. Sterling moved first, kneeling down to Miguel's level. "Miguel, how long have you known about these pictures?" The boy fidgeted with his stuffed elephant. "I saw them in the big album Mrs. Clark keeps in her room. She doesn't know I found it. There's lots of pictures of you and Papa when you were little." He looked at Sterling with unnervingly direct eyes. "You're his brother, aren't you? That's why you look like him." Before either adult could respond, they heard Victoria's voice in the hallway, approaching rapidly. Sterling quickly gathered the documents while Sophia ushered Miguel behind a bookcase. The door opened, just as Sterling managed to close his laptop. "Alexander!" Victoria's smile was sharp as she entered. "The board members are arriving early for the emergency meeting. They're quite concerned about some information that's come to light." Sterling's face betrayed nothing. "The meeting isn't scheduled until tomorrow." "Plans change." Victoria's eyes drifted to where some papers were still visible on the desk. Mr. Harrison felt it was urgent to address certain family matters, particularly regarding young Miguel's true parentage. From behind the bookcase, Miguel pressed closer to Sophia, sensing the tension in the room. Sophia held her breath, praying he would stay quiet. "I see." Sterling's voice was ice. "And I suppose you've prepared a complete presentation for the board?" Victoria's smile widened. "Oh, it's all very thoroughly documented, including some interesting papers I found in Mrs. Clark's collection. It seems she's been quite the faithful archivist of family secrets." She paused, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "Of course, there might be a way to avoid all this unpleasantness. If you were to step down voluntarily, name Harrison as your successor." "Get out." Sterling's command was quiet, but absolute. After Victoria left, Sophia emerged from behind the bookcase with Miguel. The boy looked between the adults, his young face troubled. "Are they going to take me away?" Sterling knelt again, looking Miguel in the eyes. "No, I promise you that won't happen. But Miguel, I need you to tell me everything you remember about the park in Madrid, about your father. Even the smallest detail could be important." Miguel clutched his elephant tighter. "He had a special watch like yours, with the family crest thing on it," and his face scrunched in concentration. "He always wrote in a blue notebook. He said it was full of important secrets that would keep us safe." Sterling's eyes widened. "A blue notebook? Sophia, did you ever see this?" She shook her head. "Thomas was very protective of it. The day he disappeared, the notebook vanished too. I always assumed he took it with him." "Unless he didn't," Sterling was already moving to his computer. "Unless he left it somewhere for safekeeping, something he wrote in that letter to Mother, about hiding the truth where it all began." "The park," Sophia breathed. "The duck pond in Madrid where he used to take Miguel." Sterling was already reaching for his phone. "I'll have the jet ready in an hour. We need to get to that park before Harrison figures it out." He looked at Sophia and Miguel, his expression grave. "Pack light and tell no one. If that notebook contains what I think it does, it could change everything." As Sophia hurried to prepare for their sudden journey, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something obvious. Why had Mrs. Clark kept those photos all these years? And why had Victoria seemed so confident about the board meeting? The answer hit her just as she was zipping up Miguel's small suitcase. The watch. Miguel had mentioned Thomas's watch, identical to Sterling's with the family crest. She remembered seeing that same crest somewhere else recently, but where? And then she remembered, on the letterhead of the documents Victoria had been carrying when she left the house. They weren't just racing against Harrison to find Thomas's notebook. They were racing against someone who might already have all the proof they needed to destroy everything Sterling had built and take Miguel away forever. The Sterling private jet cut through the night sky over the Atlantic, its passengers lost in their own thoughts. Miguel had finally fallen asleep, his head resting in Sophia's lap while Sterling sat across from them, his laptop illuminating his tired face as he worked. "Harrison's making his move faster than I expected," he said, breaking the hours-long silence. "The board meeting has been moved up again. We now have less than 48 hours. Sophia stroked Miguel's hair absently. "What happens if we don't find the notebook in time?" "Harrison will present his evidence to the board. With Victoria's help, he's gathered quite a collection. Old photos, letters, financial records. They're building a case that I've known about Miguel's parentage all along and concealed it to maintain control of the trust fund." Sterling's jaw tightened. "Once they prove Miguel is Thomas's son, they'll argue that I'm unfit to manage his inheritance. And then they'll petition for emergency guardianship. Harrison will claim it's in Miguel's best interest to be with family while the legal issues are sorted out." His eyes met Sophia's. "We can't let that happen." The plane landed in Madrid just as dawn was breaking. A car was waiting for them, and as they drove through the awakening city, Sophia felt a strange mix of nostalgia and dread. This was her home, where her life with Thomas had begun and ended, and now she was back with his brother searching for answers. The Retiro Park was just opening when they arrived. Sophia led them along familiar paths until they reached the duck pond. Miguel became increasingly animated as they walked, pointing out spots he remembered. "There!" he exclaimed suddenly, running toward a particular bench. "Papa always sat here. He said it was special because of the view." Sterling examined the bench carefully, running his hands along the weathered wood. "Look at these markings," he said, pointing to what appeared to be random scratches. "They're not random at all. It's a code. Thomas and I used to use something similar when we were kids." Sophia watched as Sterling pulled out a small notebook and began decoding the marks. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote, and she realized this was the closest he'd been to his brother in years. "It's coordinates," he said finally, "and a series of numbers. Could be a safety deposit box key." He showed Sophia the decoded message. "Banco de España, box 2327. The truth stays in the family." But we can't just walk into the Bank of Spain and ask for access to a safety deposit box, Sophia pointed out. Sterling's expression was grim. No, but Thomas would have arranged for that. He was always thinking ahead. He turned to Miguel. The watch you mentioned, did your father ever let you hold it? Miguel nodded eagerly. He showed me how to open the secret part. There was a tiny key inside. Sterling's eyes widened. He pulled out his own watch, identical to the one Thomas had worn, and carefully twisted the family crest. A small compartment popped open, revealing a safety deposit box key. All Sterling men receive this watch on their 18th birthday, he explained. Thomas and I used to joke about what secrets we'd hide in them. His voice caught. I never thought he'd actually use it this way. They made their way to the Bank of Spain, where Sterling's name and influence smoothed their path. The safety deposit box contained exactly one item, the blue notebook. But as Sterling opened it, his face fell. It's empty, he said in disbelief. All the pages have been torn out except this one. He held up a single sheet with a message written in Thomas's familiar hand. To whoever finds this, if you're reading this, then they found me. The real evidence is where it all began. Look for the elephant's secret. Trust no one but family. Miguel tugged at Sophia's sleeve. Mama, the elephant. Papa gave me my stuffed elephant the last time we were here. Sophia's heart raced as she pulled the worn toy from Miguel's backpack. She had always wondered why Thomas had insisted Miguel never part with it. Now examining it carefully, she felt something hard inside, hidden in the stuffing. Before she could investigate further, her phone buzzed with a text from Lucy. Victoria found the document she was looking for in Mrs. Clark's room. She's heading to the airport, to Madrid. She knows where you are. Sterling read the message over her shoulder, his face hardening. We need to move, now. Victoria's not working alone. Harrison must have people here in Madrid, too. As they hurried from the bank, Sophia noticed a man in a dark suit speaking urgently into his phone, his eyes following their movement. Another man appeared at the end of the street, then another. They were being surrounded. Sterling saw it too. He guided them quickly, into a side street, then through a series of narrow alleys. There's a safe house nearby, he whispered. We just need to make it there without being seen. But as they turned another corner, they found their path blocked by a familiar face. Mrs. Clark stood there, looking oddly out of place in the Madrid alley. I'm afraid I can't let you go any further, she said, her British accent crisp in the morning air. You see, I made a promise to Thomas before he disappeared. A promise about keeping certain secrets hidden. You knew my brother? Sterling's voice was barely a whisper. Better than you think, Mrs. Clark replied. I was there the night everything changed, the night your parents... She paused, choosing her words carefully. The night of the accident. Thomas discovered something he wasn't supposed to know. Something about your father's business dealings with Harrison's father. Sophia clutched Miguel closer as Mrs. Clark continued. Thomas couldn't prove it then, but he spent years gathering evidence. That's what's in that elephant. Proof that could destroy not just Harrison, but half the business empires in New York. The sound of footsteps echoed from both ends of the alley. They were running out of time. Mrs. Clark pressed a key into Sterling's hand. Third floor, apartment 4B. There's a back entrance through the courtyard. Go. I'll hold them off as long as I can. As they slipped away, Sophia heard Mrs. Clark's voice ring out, greeting Victoria and her men with elaborate explanations about getting lost while sightseeing. The old housekeeper had been playing her own game all along, it seemed, keeping her promises to both Sterling brothers in her own way. Now they just had to reach the safe house and discover what secret Thomas had hidden inside Miguel's beloved toy, before Victoria and her men found them first. The safe house was a modest apartment, with heavy curtains and sparse furniture. Sterling secured the locks while Sophia guided Miguel to a worn sofa in the corner. The boy clutched his stuffed elephant tightly, suddenly reluctant to part with it. Miguel, Sophia said gently, kneeling before him, I know this is your special friend, but we need to see what Papa hidden inside. Remember what the note said about the elephant's secret. The boy nodded slowly. But Papa said I should only open it if something really important happened. Is this really important, Mama? Sterling joined them. his expression softening as he looked at his nephew. "Yes, Miguel. This is exactly the kind of important moment your father was preparing for. You're helping protect our family, just like he wanted you to." Those words seemed to reach something in Miguel. He carefully handed the elephant to Sophia, then whispered, "There's a special way to open it. Papa showed me once. You have to pull the right ear 3 times and then press the left foot." Sophia followed his instructions and they heard a soft click. A small seam appeared in the elephant's back, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a USB drive and a folded letter addressed to Alex. Sterling's hands shook as he opened the letter. His eyes scanned the pages quickly, his face growing paler with each line. "Sophia," he said hoarsely, "you need to read this." The letter was dated just weeks before Thomas disappeared. "Dear Alex, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. I've discovered something about Dad's accident that changes everything. It wasn't random, and it wasn't an accident at all. I found Dad's private records, hidden in encrypted files that Harrison's father never knew existed. Dad was gathering evidence of massive financial fraud, not just in our company, but throughout the entire network of family businesses. Harrison Sr. was at the center of it all, using our company's legitimate operations to hide his illegal schemes. Dad was planning to expose everything, but Harrison Sr. found out. The night of the accident, Dad called me. He said he was going to meet with federal investigators the next day. He never made it to that meeting. I've spent years gathering proof, building on Dad's original investigation. It's all here on this drive, every transaction, every shell company, every bribe. But it goes deeper than just Harrison Sr. Half the society families in New York are implicated, Alex. Their children inherited not just wealth, but a legacy built on lies. The reason I'm writing this now is that they've found me. Harrison Jr. is just like his father. He's figured out what I'm doing. I have to disappear to protect my family. Sophia doesn't know any of this. I've kept her in the dark to keep her safe. But Miguel, Alex, he's not just my son. He's the key to everything. Dad's real will, his final testament, is hidden in the family vault. He changed it the day before the accident, adding a clause that the entire Sterling fortune can only pass to an heir who proves worthy of the Sterling name, not by blood alone, but by choosing truth over power, justice over wealth. He knew what was coming, Alex. He was trying to protect our legacy. Take care of them, brother. Keep Miguel safe. And when the time is right, use what's on this drive to finish what Dad started. Your brother, Thomas. Sophia's hands trembled as she finished reading. "All this time," she whispered, "Thomas was trying to protect us. That's why he left so suddenly." Sterling had connected the USB drive to his laptop, his face illuminated by the screen as he scrolled through document after document. "This is incredible," he muttered. "Transaction records, offshore accounts, recorded conversations. Thomas documented everything." A sharp knock at the door made them all freeze. "Mr. Sterling," Victoria's voice called out sweetly, "I know you're in there. Let's discuss this like reasonable people." Sterling quickly copied the files to a secure cloud server as Sophia gathered Miguel into her arms. "There's a fire escape through the bedroom," he whispered. "We need to get these files to my lawyers immediately." Another knock, harder this time. "The board meeting starts in 12 hours, Alexander. Think about your options. Harrison is willing to be reasonable if you cooperate." They slipped into the bedroom just as they heard the sound of a key in the lock. Victoria had somehow gotten a copy of Mrs. Clark's key. Sterling quietly closed the bedroom door, then helped Sophia and Miguel onto the fire escape. But as they descended, Sophia saw movement in the alley below. More of Harrison's men were arriving, covering every exit. They were trapped between Victoria above and her associates below. Sterling pulled out his phone, quickly typing something. Seconds later, they heard sirens in the distance, growing closer. A diversion, Sophia realized. He was buying them time. "Miguel," Sterling said quietly, "do you trust me?" The boy looked at his uncle, then nodded solemnly. Good, because what I'm about to tell you is very important. Your father was a hero, Miguel. He was trying to fix something wrong in our family, to make things right. Now we need to help him finish that work. But we have to be very brave. Can you be brave like your father? Miguel straightened up, still clutching his now empty elephant. Yes, Uncle Alex. The sound of Victoria's heels clicking on the fire escape above them spurred them into action. Sterling led them to a narrow ledge that connected to the adjacent building. It wasn't an easy path, but it was their only option. As they carefully made their way across, Sophia could hear Victoria's frustrated cry when she discovered the empty bedroom. The sirens were getting closer, and lights were beginning to come on in neighboring buildings. They had the evidence now, but they still had to get it to the right people before the board meeting. And even then, Sophia realized, proving the truth about the past wouldn't automatically protect their future. Harrison had too much power, too many allies. The real battle was just beginning, and it would take more than just evidence to win. It would take the one thing Thomas had valued above all else: family standing together, choosing truth over power, just as the original Sterling had hoped. As they finally reached safety in the adjacent building, Sophia saw something in Sterling's expression she'd never seen before: hope mixed with fierce determination. Thomas's letter hadn't just revealed the truth about the past, it had given his brother a chance to make things right. Now they just had to survive long enough to use it. The Madrid dawn was breaking as Sterling hurried Sophia and Miguel through the narrow streets of the old city. They had managed to escape Victoria, but her presence in Madrid meant Harrison was moving faster than anticipated. Sterling's phone buzzed constantly with updates from his legal team in New York. The board meeting has been moved up again, he said grimly, checking his messages as they hurried through a quiet plaza. Harrison's called an emergency session for 3 p.m. New York time. That gives us less than 8 hours. Sophia adjusted Miguel in her arms. The boy had finally succumbed to exhaustion. Can't you just email the files to your lawyers? Sterling shook his head. Too risky? Harrison's people could intercept the transmission. The only secure way is to deliver the drive in person to my legal team. They need the original files to verify the authenticity. They ducked into a small cafe, needing a moment to regroup and plan. As Sophia got Miguel settled in a quiet corner with hot chocolate, Sterling made a series of urgent calls. His expression grew increasingly troubled with each conversation. Harrison's been busy, he said after hanging up. He's already contacted Child Protective Services in New York. They'll be waiting at the board meeting with an emergency custody order for Miguel, unless we can prove the corruption first. Sophia's hands tightened around her coffee cup. How did he get them involved so quickly? Money talks, Sterling said bitterly. And Harrison has half of New York's elite backing him. They're all implicated in those files Thomas gathered. They'll do anything to keep this evidence from coming to light. A breaking news alert on the cafe's television caught their attention. The headline made Sophia's blood run cold. Sterling Enterprises in crisis. Emergency board meeting called amid allegations of air concealment. Sterling watched the report with growing concern. Harrison's taking this public. He's painting me as the villain who kept Miguel from his rightful inheritance. He turned to Sophia. We need to split up. What? No, we need to stay together. Listen to me. Sterling's voice was urgent but gentle. Harrison's men will be watching all the private airports, expecting us to fly back together. But there's a commercial flight to New York leaving in an hour. You and Miguel can take that. You'll be less conspicuous traveling as a normal family. I'll take our jet on a different route. Make sure they follow me instead. Sophia wanted to protest, but she could see the logic. What about the evidence? Sterling pulled out the USB drive and, to her surprise, handed it to her. Keep it safe. My lawyers will meet you at JFK. Whatever happens, this needs to reach them before the board meeting. A subtle movement outside the cafe window caught Sophia's attention. A man in a dark suit was speaking into his phone, trying too hard to look casual. We need to move, she whispered. They've found us. Sterling had seen it too. He quickly paid for their drinks and led them through the cafe's kitchen, ignoring the startled protests of the staff. They emerged into a delivery alley just as they heard voices approaching from both directions. The market, Sophia said suddenly, pointing to where they could see the colorful awnings of Madrid's famous Mercado de San Miguel just a block away. We can lose them in the morning crowd. They merged into the stream of early shoppers entering the market, Sophia carrying a still sleeping Miguel, while Sterling guided them through the maze of vendors. The market was coming alive, filled with locals buying fresh bread and produce for the day. Through the gaps between stalls, Sophia could see Victoria's men systematically working their way through the market. Sterling noticed too, and made a quick decision. "Sarah," he called out suddenly, approaching an elderly vendor setting up her flower stall. The woman looked up, confused, until Sterling rapidly explained something in fluent Spanish. Her face softened with understanding, and she quickly ushered Sophia and Miguel behind her display. "My mother used to buy flowers here," Sterling explained, softly as they crouched behind the riot of colors and fragrance. "Sarah's family has owned this stall for generations." They watched through gaps in the flowers as Victoria stalked past, her designer heels clicking on the market's stone floor. Sarah engaged her in an animated conversation about roses, gesturing in the opposite direction when Victoria asked if she'd seen any tourists pass by. Once the coast was clear, Sarah helped them slip out through the vendor's entrance. She pressed a bouquet into Sophia's hands with a knowing smile, the flowers providing the perfect prop for their cover as tourists. At the airport, Sterling guided them to the commercial terminal while maintaining the appearance of heading toward the private aviation area. As they prepared to separate, Miguel finally stirred awake. "Uncle Alex," he asked sleepily, "are you coming with us?" Sterling knelt down to Miguel's level. "I'll meet you in New York, champion, but I need you to do something very important. For me, I need you to take care of your mother just like your father would want you to. Can you do that?" Miguel nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by throwing his arms around Sterling's neck in a tight hug. Sophia saw something break in Sterling's carefully maintained facade as he hugged his nephew back. "Ms. Martinez," a subtle voice spoke behind them. They turned to see a woman in a flight attendant's uniform. "Mrs. Clark sent me. I'll make sure you and your son are safely escorted onto the flight." As Sophia and Miguel followed the flight attendant, Sophia looked back one last time. Sterling stood watching them, his figure straight and determined. He gave her a single nod, a promise that somehow they would make this right. But as their plane took off an hour later, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that Harrison had anticipated this move. The evidence they carried was powerful, but Harrison had been playing this game for years. What other cards did he have left to play? The answer to that question was waiting for them in New York, where the biggest battle of their lives was about to begin. The New York skyline materialized through the airplane window as their flight began its descent into JFK. Sophia clutched her handbag containing the USB drive, acutely aware that everything depended on what happened in the next few hours. Miguel sat beside her, unusually quiet. His toy elephant still held close despite its now empty secret compartment. As they taxied to the gate, Sophia's phone lit up with a message from Lucy. "Be careful. Victoria arrived on an earlier flight. She's meeting with Harrison at the Sterling building." Another message followed quickly. "Mrs. Clark left something for you in the private lounge at Terminal 4. She says it's crucial." The flight attendant who had helped them in Madrid appeared, again, guiding them through a private exit and personally escorting them to the terminal. In the exclusive lounge, they found a package waiting, a thick manila envelope with Sophia's name written in Mrs. Clark's elegant handwriting. Inside was a leather-bound diary and a note. "This belonged to Claire Sterling, Alexander and Thomas's mother. Read page 42. You'll understand why I've kept it all these years." Sophia's hands trembled as she opened the diary to the marked page. The entry was dated just days before the tragic accident. "Thomas discovered something in Richard's files today. He's terrified, and with good reason. Harrison Sr. has been using our Children's Charity Foundation to hide his dealings. Millions meant for orphanages and schools, all diverted to offshore accounts. Richard plans to expose everything tomorrow. I've changed the trust requirements, The fortune can only pass to an heir who proves worthy of the sterling name, someone who chooses truth over power. I pray I'm doing the right thing. Alexander doesn't know it yet, but he's always been stronger than he believes. When the time comes, he'll understand why this choice matters more than any inheritance. Sophia's phone buzzed again, a message from Sterling. Harrison's called a press conference before the board meeting. Turn on the TV. The lounge's television was already tuned to the business news. Harrison stood at a podium in front of Sterling Enterprises, his expression grave as cameras flashed. It pains me to reveal this, he was saying, but recent evidence has come to light, showing that Alexander Sterling has been concealing the existence of the true heir to the Sterling fortune, his own nephew. This deliberate deception, aimed at maintaining control of the company, demonstrates his unfitness to lead. The cameras panned to show Victoria standing nearby, holding a folder of documents. We have proof, Harrison continued, that Alexander has known about young Miguel's parentage for years. This betrayal of family trust cannot stand. The board will vote today not just on leadership, but on the future of Sterling Enterprises itself. Sophia's phone rang. Sterling's lawyers. Mrs. Sterling, we're in the terminal parking lot. We need that drive immediately to prepare for the board meeting. But something felt wrong. The way Harrison spoke, his confidence. He knew about the drive, somehow he knew they had it. Sophia's instincts screamed at her to be careful. Could you describe the car you're in? She asked the caller. A slight pause. A black SUV, we're parked in Section C. Sophia's blood ran cold. Through the lounge window she could see Section C and the Sterling legal team's distinctive blue town cars. The black SUVs belonged to Harrison's security team. I understand, she said calmly. I'll be right there. She hung up and immediately called Sterling. They're here, she whispered when he answered. Harrison's men are posing as your lawyers. Listen carefully. Sterling's voice was tense. Lucy is 5 minutes away in a taxi. Get to the departure level, door 4B. She'll take you to the real legal team. He paused. And Sophia, what you found in my mother's diary, it changes everything. Harrison doesn't just want the company. He wants to bury the evidence of what his father did to my family. As Sophia and Miguel made their way through the terminal, she noticed men in suits converging from different directions. Harrison's people were everywhere, closing in. They reached the departure level just as a yellow taxi pulled up. Lucy leaned out, waving frantically. Hurry! They were almost to the taxi when Victoria's voice rang out behind them. Mrs. Sterling, how convenient to find you here. Sophia turned to see Victoria approaching, flanked by security guards. She held up a document with an official seal. I have here an emergency custody order for Miguel. If you'll just come with us quietly. No. The voice was small but firm. Everyone turned to look at Miguel, who stood straight and tall despite his fear. My papa left me with Mama to keep me. Safe? You're the bad ones, the ones he was hiding from. Victoria's smile turned cold. Such an imagination. But then, Thomas always did fill people's heads with crazy stories about conspiracies and corruption. Such a troubled man, no wonder he abandoned his family. He didn't abandon us, Sophia said, her voice growing stronger. He protected us from people like you and Harrison, people who would sacrifice children's futures for their own greed. Victoria's face hardened. Take the boy, she commanded the guards. We have a court order. But before they could move, police sirens filled the air. Through the terminal windows, Sophia could see police cars arriving, lights flashing. Actually, Lucy said, holding up her phone, that custody order won't hold up. Not now that the FBI has Harrison Sr.'s real financial records, the ones Mrs. Clark has been gathering for years, waiting for this moment. Victoria's composure cracked. You're bluffing. Those records were destroyed. Were they? Sophia reached into her bag, but instead of the USB drive, she pulled out Claire Sterling's diary. Thomas wasn't the only one keeping records. A mother knows how to protect her children, even after she's gone. The police were entering the terminal now, and Victoria's guards began to back away, unwilling to risk arrest. Victoria looked around wildly, realizing her plan was unraveling. "This isn't over," she snarled, before turning and disappearing into the crowd. In the taxi, speeding toward Manhattan, Sophia finally let herself breathe. Lucy explained that Sterling had arranged everything: the police, the FBI, even the timing of Mrs. Clark's diary revelation. But as they approached the Sterling building, where reporters were still gathered from Harrison's press conference, Sophia knew the real battle was just beginning. They had the evidence now, but Harrison still had the board's support. Years of carefully cultivated loyalty bought with shares of his father's stolen fortune. The next hour would determine not just Miguel's future, but the legacy of the entire Sterling family. And somewhere in the building above them, Harrison was preparing for what he believed would be his moment of triumph. He had no idea what was coming. The Sterling building's marble lobby was packed with reporters when Sophia, Miguel, and Lucy arrived. Through the glass doors, they could see Harrison holding court, surrounded by board members and shareholders. He looked supremely confident, like a man about to claim his destiny. "Mrs. Sterling." The reporters noticed her arrival, cameras flashing as they surged forward. But before they could reach her, the crowd parted. Sterling himself stood at the elevator, impeccably dressed despite having just flown across the Atlantic. "Perfect timing," he said quietly as they joined him. His hand found Miguel's shoulder, squeezing gently. "Ready to help me tell the truth, champion?" Miguel nodded solemnly, still clutching his empty elephant. The private elevator carried them to the top floor in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Sophia could feel the USB drive pressing against her side, safely hidden in an inside pocket of her jacket. The boardroom doors were already open, revealing a scene of calculated drama. Harrison stood at the head of the long table, Victoria at his side. The board members, 12 of New York's most powerful business leaders, sat in their usual places. But there were new additions: stern-faced lawyers, child services representatives, and in the corner, Mrs. Clark, looking oddly satisfied. "Ah, Alexander." Harrison's smile was razor-sharp. "How kind of you to join us for this historic moment. And you brought young Miguel. Perfect." The child services team was just asking about him. Sterling stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Before we begin, Charles, I believe there are some documents the board needs to review." Harrison's smile didn't waver. "So of course, Victoria, please distribute the evidence we've gathered." Victoria began passing out folders to the board members. "As you'll see, these records clearly show that Alexander has known about Miguel's parentage for years. He deliberately concealed the existence of a legitimate heir to maintain his control of the company." The board members began murmuring as they reviewed the documents. Sterling waited until the last folder was distributed before speaking. "Interesting. Files, Charles, but incomplete." He nodded to Sophia, who removed the USB drive from her jacket. "I think it's time the board saw the full picture." Harrison's composure cracked slightly. "We've already presented the relevant evidence." "Have you?" Sterling's voice carried throughout the room. "Have you shown them what Thomas discovered about your father's embezzlement, about how he used our children's charity foundation to hide millions in stolen funds?" The murmuring grew louder. Harrison's face flushed. "These are baseless accusations." "Are they?" Mrs. Clark stepped forward, producing a leather-bound book. "This is Claire Sterling's personal diary. She documented everything, including your father's threats against her family the day before the accident." Chaos erupted in the boardroom. Board members were shouting questions. Lawyers were demanding to see the new evidence. And through it all, Harrison's face grew darker with rage. "Enough!" he roared. "This is all a desperate fabrication. The boy is Thomas Sterling's son. That's all that matters. The trust must pass to him, with a proper guardian appointed to manage it. Someone with the family's best interests at heart." "You mean someone like you?" Sterling's voice was deadly quiet. "Someone who would continue his father's legacy of stealing from children's charities? Is that what you call family interests, Charles?" Victoria stepped forward, her desperation showing. "The custody order is already signed. Miguel belongs with his father's family." "I am with my family." Miguel's clear voice cut through the noise. Everyone turned to look at the small boy who had moved to stand between his mother and uncle. Papa told me in the park. He said Uncle Alex would protect us from the bad people who hurt Grandma and Grandpa. Harrison's control finally snapped. You think you've won. That diary is worthless in court, and that drive. He laughed harshly. Did you really think I wouldn't have a backup plan? He pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. Right now, my teams are seizing control of every Sterling Enterprise subsidiary. By tomorrow morning, the company's assets will be so tied up in legal challenges that it will take years to sort out. Unless, his smile returned, cruel and calculating, unless Alexander steps down immediately, renouncing all claims to the company and the trust. The board members watched in shocked silence as Harrison laid out his ultimatum. It's your choice. Cousin, the company or the truth, what's it going to be? Sterling looked around the room, at the board members he'd worked with for years, at Mrs. Clark, who had protected his family's secrets, at Sophia, who had risked everything to help him, and finally at Miguel, who looked back at him with complete trust. You know, Charles, he said slowly, my mother wrote something interesting in her diary. She said the fortune could only pass to an heir who proves worthy of the Sterling name, someone who chooses truth over power. He stepped forward, facing Harrison directly. I choose the truth. Before Harrison could respond, the boardroom doors opened again. A group of FBI agents entered, led by a serious-looking woman in a suit. Charles Harrison, she announced, we have a federal warrant to seize all records relating to the Sterling Foundation and its subsidiaries. We also have some questions. Tell about your father's overseas accounts. Harrison's face went pale. You can't prove anything. The records were destroyed years ago. Were they? Mrs. Clark smiled. I've worked in this building for 30 years, Mr. Harrison. Did you really think I spent all that time just managing households? Thomas wasn't the only one keeping records. As the agents began securing the room and collecting documents, Sterling addressed the board. Ladies and gentlemen, you have a choice to make. You can support Harrison's attempt to bury the truth, or you can help me restore this company to what it was meant to be, a force for good, not greed. One by one, the board members stood. The message was clear. They were with Sterling. Harrison, watching his plans crumble, made one last desperate move. He lunged for Sophia, reaching for the drive she still held. But before anyone could react, Miguel swung his stuffed elephant with all his might, hitting Harrison's leg and causing him to stumble. As Harrison was led away by FBI agents still protesting his innocence, Sterling knelt beside Miguel. Your father would be very proud of you, he said softly. You protected our family just like he did. The boardroom gradually emptied, leaving just Sterling, Sophia, Miguel, and Mrs. Clark. The old housekeeper smiled at them. Claire would be proud too, she said. Her boys finally working together, even if Thomas couldn't be here to see it. Sterling looked at Sophia and Miguel, his family, unexpected but precious. Thomas is here, he said, in every brave choice Miguel makes, in every truth we've uncovered. And now we can finally tell his story the way it deserves to be told. Outside the boardroom windows, the New York sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors, a fitting end to a day that had changed everything. The battle was over, but Sophia knew their story, their real story, was just beginning. 6 months had passed since the dramatic boardroom confrontation. The Sterling Building's grand ballroom was filled with light and laughter as guests gathered for the official launch of the Thomas Sterling Foundation for Children's Education. The same society figures who had once whispered behind Sophia's back now approached her with warm smiles and enthusiastic support for the Foundation's mission. Sophia stood at the edge of the crowd, watching Miguel charm a group of donors with his detailed explanation of the Foundation's first project, rebuilding and modernizing schools in underprivileged neighborhoods. At 8 years old, he had insisted on being involved in every aspect of the planning, showing the same passion for helping others that had driven his father's actions. He's a natural, Sterling said, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of champagne. Just like Thomas was at that age. He handed her one of the glasses, his wedding ring catching the light. Their second wedding ceremony, the real one, had been a small intimate affair in the manor's garden just a month ago. This time there had been no contracts, no pretense, just two people who had found love in the most unexpected circumstances. Mrs. Clark would say it runs in the family, Sophia smiled, watching their former housekeeper, now the foundation's chief of operations, expertly directing the event staff. After Harrison's arrest, Mrs. Clark had finally shared the full story of her role in the Sterling family saga. She had been Claire Sterling's closest friend and confidant, promising to watch over both Sterling's sons and protect the evidence that would eventually bring justice to the family. The Foundation's headquarters now occupied the same floor where Harrison had once plotted his takeovers. The stolen millions had been recovered and multiplied, dedicated to fulfilling the original Sterling legacy of education and opportunity for all children. "Have you seen the latest designs for the Madrid campus?" Sterling asked, his eyes bright with excitement. The Foundation's international expansion was starting with a state-of-the-art school in the city where Thomas had found love and where Miguel had spent his early years. "The architects incorporated your suggestions about the cultural exchange programs." Sophia nodded, remembering the countless hours they had spent planning this project together. Sterling Enterprises had emerged stronger from the scandal, its new transparency and ethical leadership, attracting investors who shared their vision for responsible business practices. "Uncle Alex," Miguel called out, running over to them, "can we show them Papa's special room now?" Sterling checked his watch and nodded. The guests were led to a newly renovated wing of the building where a set of ornate doors bore a simple plaque: the Thomas Sterling Memorial Library. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs telling the story of the Sterling family, not the sanitized version that had been presented to society for years, but the real story with all its complexity and courage. Thomas's blue notebook held a place of honor in a central display case, along with Claire Sterling's diary and other artifacts that had helped uncover the truth. As Sterling addressed the gathered crowd, Sophia's eyes were drawn to a particular photograph. It showed Thomas in the Madrid park, feeding ducks with a young Miguel. She had never seen this photo before, but Mrs. Clark had found it among Thomas's personal effects, preserved all these years. "This library," Sterling was saying, "represents more than just our family's history. It stands as a reminder that truth, no matter how long buried, will always find its way to the light. My brother Thomas believed that. He gave everything to protect that truth, and to protect the people he loved." Miguel slipped his hand into Sophia's, and she squeezed it gently. The old stuffed elephant he had carried through their adventures now sat in a special corner of his room, retired but never forgotten. In its place, he carried a small notebook of his own, already filled with his ideas for helping other children. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, Sophia found Sterling in his study, the same room where he had first played with Miguel all those months ago. He was looking out the window at the city lights, lost in thought. "Penny for Reese tea. Your thoughts?" she asked, wrapping her arms around him from behind. He turned to face her, his expression soft. "I was just thinking about choices, about what my mother wrote in her diary, that the fortune should go to someone who chooses truth over power." He smiled. She would have loved seeing how Miguel has embraced that legacy. "And what about his uncle?" Sophia teased. "Has he embraced it too?" Instead of answering, Sterling led her to his desk and opened a drawer. Inside was a sealed envelope with Thomas's handwriting. "This arrived today," he said quietly. "Posted years ago with instructions to deliver it on this exact." Together, they opened the letter. Thomas's words, written so long ago, filled the page. "Dear Alex and Sophia, if you're reading this, then everything I hoped for has come to pass. The truth has been revealed, justice has been served, and, most importantly, you've found each other. I knew from the moment I met Sophia that she had the strength our family needed, the strength to choose love over fear, truth over convenience. Alex, brother, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything in person, but I knew you would understand when the time was right. You were always the better man, even if you couldn't see it yourself. Take care of my son, but more than that, let him take care of you. Let him teach you what I learned too late. That family is about more than duty or legacy. It's about love, simple and pure. Sophia, mi amor, thank you for giving our son the strength and wisdom to carry on the best parts of both our families. In Miguel, I see the future I always dreamed of. A sterling who understands that true wealth lies not in bank accounts or boardrooms, but in the lives we touch and the truths we uphold. Together, you three have built something beautiful from the ashes of our family's past. That is the greatest legacy any father could hope for. All my love, Thomas. Sophia wiped tears from her eyes as Sterling folded the letter carefully. Through the study door, they could hear Miguel in the library, enthusiastically showing Lucy his latest ideas for the Foundation's programs. You know, Sterling said softly, when you first arrived at my office with that custody battle story, I thought I was saving you and Miguel. I never imagined you would end up saving all of us. Sophia smiled, remembering that first meeting that seemed so long ago. Maybe that's what family really means, saving each other over and over again until we all find our way home. As see. If on cue, Miguel burst into the study, his notebook clutched in his hands. Mama, Uncle Alex, I just had the best idea for the new school. Sterling lifted Miguel onto his lap, and Sophia perched on the desk beside them, listening as their son shared his vision for the future. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere, she was sure, Thomas was smiling. Their marriage may have begun as a contract, but it had grown into something far more precious, a testament to the power of truth, the strength of family, and the unexpected ways that love could heal even the deepest wounds. In the end, they had all found exactly what they needed, not in the power of the sterling name or the wealth it commanded, but in the simple truth of belonging together.